Hey guys, my name's Ashley with Blue Hill Glass, and today I'm going to show you how I created these stained glass coffin boxes. The pattern for creating one of these on your own is for sale at the link below, as well as the tool that I used to create it. And I really love the way these turned out. I think they're really cool, and I added that beveled lid on the top. I think that gives it something really special. So let's get started and I'll show you how I made them. So here's our Prism Pro tool that I'll be using to create the coffin box. We're adding this one to a lineup of a lot of other 3D stained glass tools that we offer. So we're calling this the Prism Pro because it makes all kinds of regular prisms, and it comes with your base with these cards that you can move around, and they create different kinds of prisms. You can make a triangular prism, a square prism, a rectangular prism, a pentagonal prism, a hexagonal prism, and an octagonal prism. Now I'm going to use my square cards to create the base on the coffin box, so go ahead and get those out. And to do the beveled lid, I'm going to use the octagon cards. When you purchase the pattern, you're going to get a couple sheets of paper. I want you to go ahead and print those off, and I've got some instructions here. The first page is just going to give you a little background, and that's going to have the link to this video there. And then you've got your pattern pieces for the lid. You're going to cut those out and trace them onto your glass. Then you got your coffin box lid kind of mock-up, and so what I've done here is I put it together, and I decided to cut it out and tape it together. By giving myself a mock-up, I can mark all of those points that I have on the pattern, like giving you suggestions about where your hooks are going to go, where your hinge is going to go, and just by cutting it apart and taping it together, that allows you to visualize it. And I found that that really helped me when I was putting it together, like where I'm not supposed to solder, where I'm supposed to solder. Because, like, for example, the hinge, you don't want to put any solder at all in that one seam when you're working it, because it's going to be so hard to get to bury your hinge into the seam if there's already solder there. So just by making this mock-up, it'll just make it easier for you to see where everything goes and not make any mistakes. Of course, this part is totally optional, so just skip ahead if you don't want to do this part. So next is the base patterns. You're going to cut all of those out and trace them onto your glass, and then here's the mock-up page. It actually kind of shows you where where everything goes, so where your hinge is going to be. If you cut it out correctly and taped it together correctly, all of the numbers are going to be on the outside of the box. So now I've got it all together. You can see all the numbers are on the outside, and you might want to keep these numbers marked on your glass pieces until after you clean it. But you can see number 13 on the lid piece. I'm going to tape that to number 4 on the base piece, and that's where your hinge is going to go. So this is just a good way to visualize how it's going to come together. You can change the hinge to the other side if you want, but you're going to know that you're going to put your hinge here. And I just take a marker and just kind of mark, like, these two spots is where your hook goes, this is where your hinge goes, so don't put any solder in that. Now let's make the hinge. So I'm going to take a tube. This is a brass tube that's 3/32 of an inch, and I'm going to put it right on that hinge where it's going to be at, and I'm going to mark it with my Sharpie, just exactly the width of it. You can go a little bit shorter, but you definitely don't want to go wider than the piece of glass. Next, I'll cut it with my Dremel tool. You could also use a hacksaw, but a Dremel is going to give you a much nicer, cleaner edge. Now I slid the rod inside the tube, and then I put it on a piece of glass, that piece number 4, and I just bend it over the edge and get a nice 90-degree angle, and then I'll put it back on the glass and bend it over on the other side. So I'm using 1/16 of an inch rod here. It fits snugly inside of that tube, and if you'd like to purchase that, the link is in the description below. Now you can use your Dremel or hacksaw to cut it off, and you want to leave about an inch overhang and just make sure that it fits nicely on your piece. Now I'm going to get out my Prism Pro and my square cards. I need 2 of those because they're going to cradle the glass. I'm going to put them in, and then I'm going to use just an extra one of those rods that I have. I found that it was helpful for this 90-degree angle. So remember, when you're making 3D stained glass projects, you have to form a V like this with your 2 pieces of glass, leaving that little wedge empty. That's where your solder is going to go on the outside. So don't overlap them. So now I'll place those first 2 pieces into my Prism Pro, and I'm going to put just a small amount of flux. Really don't want to overdo it. And I'm going to do lead-free solder because this is a jewelry box. People are going to be touching it often, so we want it to be made lead-free and be safe. Now I'll just start filling in all of my seams, and remember, this is lead-free, so I might need to crank up my iron a little bit if it's not flowing smoothly. I got a little bit too much there, and I could just knock it right down in the center of the Prism Pro. So I'll go ahead and continue assembling, putting on my pieces, adding flux, tacking together, and then soldering. I find that if you tack it first and then solder, it'll go a lot better. If you try to solder all at once, it might move around a little bit. So once I'm finished with those sides, I'm going to take my 2 cards and just move them closer together on the Prism Pro so that they can cradle that smaller piece of glass there, and then just continue on. So once the Prism Pro has gotten your angles right, then I found sometimes it was easier just to take it off of the Prism Pro to use those angles it already created and tack it together. Now that I have got the bottom done, I'm going to do that top edge. So as you can see, my cards are too far apart, so I just slid them closer together until it could cradle that piece of glass. So while the Prism Pro is amazing and it's going to help you get angles and quit taping your projects, it can't do absolutely everything. So this angle here was a little different, so I just took it off the Prism Pro to tack it. But because I had it there and it already created that angle for me, it made it a whole lot easier. Okay, so now we're going to create a hook on the base to be able to attach some jewelry chain to. So you're just going to take some pre-tinned copper wire. I used 18 gauge. I'm going to spin it over and make a little hook and then pinch it off with my pliers. Now we're going to bury that hook in seam A. That's the seam between numbers 7 and 6 on your pattern, and just refer back to your pattern guide if you need it. So we're just going to do it kind of facing up like this. So you can see how my hook is kind of curved in. I'm just going to grab it with my pliers, and it took me a couple tries because it's hard to get it positioned just right. But I'm going to put it up like this, and I want you to put it down a little bit. You don't want it sticking out because then your lid won't close. So I would just go down like 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch down from the top of the box, just so it doesn't hinder your lid at all. solder the inside of the box, but I want you to avoid those two seams B and C. Just leave them tacked together for now, because if it gets hot and bleeds through, it's going to ruin your hinge. So you can solder all the seams, you can do edging around the top, but do not solder the top of piece 4. You can lightly tin it, but do not put any thick beads on it. And you also want to do the edges of all of these pieces as well, tin the edges. I kind of got into the groove of things and didn't heed my own advice. So you can see right here I realized that it got too hot like I said it would, and it bled through into my hinge seam. It's not that big, but I'm gonna go ahead and melt that away right now so that it doesn't cause a problem, because if you get a bunch of solder in there, it's gonna be hard to get your hinge flat. So I'm just gonna go ahead and remove that right now. Now go ahead and cover up that hook, just putting a smooth bead over top of it so that you don't see it's not bumpy. Next I'll tin all of those edges with a very small amount of flux, and you might want to turn your iron down because the foil is very vulnerable right here. And then just lightly put a little bit of solder, and we're going to do that same thing on the outside as well. And you can do that on all the seams, just don't cover up those seams where your hinge goes. Now let's tap those edges, remembering that on piece 4, I'm just going to lightly tin it and not add a whole bunch. Now I'm going to do my outer seams, and with all 3D projects I find it's easiest to kind of tin the edges first and then go back and fill in the wider gaps with more solder to get a smooth bead. Here I just used my Prism Pro to prop it up so that I could get those seams level to the ground, so I could get a bead that wouldn't fall off. So that's what I'm doing here. That's not really the intention of the Prism Pro, but I found it was really helpful and it worked. Now my base is completely soldered except for seams B and C. Now I'm going to take out my square cards that I was using for the base and replace them with the octagon card to do the beveled lid. Now I can put in my first two pieces. I found that for the square card that the rod was helpful to kind of wedge that space, but for this octagon card it wasn't needed. So just put your first piece in, and then for pieces 11 and 13 they look identical, but the bottom side of those pieces is a little pointier, so put that pointier side towards the bottom, facing the bottom of the coffin. Now that my lid is all tacked together, I'm just going to put it on top of my base and make sure that it all lines up right. And now I'm going to find seam D, and I'm going to make another hook so that I can add that jewelry chain later to have a little stop on my lid so it doesn't fall all the way back. Once again, remember that you don't want it sticking out any, so you'll probably have to trim it down, and it's going to be really small. But just trim it down until it sits just inside of the lid, and then go ahead and bury it in the lead line. Now I'm going to solder all of the rest of the lid, and I'm not really sure why I did this with my hand and didn't do it on the Prism Pro like it did on the base. I just turned on music and kind of got lost in it, so I tried it both ways. You just have to hold it up with your hand if you do it like this, but you can solder a bunch of these angles on the Prism Pro. So a lot of our other 3D printed molds, I do not recommend soldering on them because it will melt it, it'll get too hot. But the Prism Pro is a little bit different because it's just cradling it, and if you do have drips, they'll just fall through to the bottom. So you do have that option with this one, unlike some of our other 3D printed molds. Okay, so now that the top and the bottom are pretty much done, I'm gonna put it back on there, and it's time to add the hinge. So this is the nerve-wracking part, but we're gonna make it through. So we're going to put our hinge back onto the lid, kind of position it in place where it's going to go. Make sure that the rods go down into the seams nicely, and if you need to bend them a little bit to get them to fit more snugly, you can do that now. Now I'm going to take a Sharpie and I'm just going to mark on the top of the foil, going down onto the hinge and then down onto the foil onto the base. And I'm just going to put a couple little reference marks there for me. This is just to make sure that when I solder it onto the lid in just a second, it all lines up. So I'm just going to match those Sharpie lines that I have on the foil of the lid. So start by just tacking them into place, and you definitely want to do this in case you got it off a little bit. You can still take it off at this point. I recommend turning your iron down for this part, and then once you have it tacked in those 3 places, it should have a nice hold. You want to make sure that you are not soldering the rod part, the hinge part that swings around. You do not want that to be encumbered, so you want to make sure that it moves completely. And then also you do not want to solder your rod to your tube, so make sure that you can spin it before you go any further. If you accidentally connect them, you'll need to completely take that off and start over. So now I'm going to solder just the tube part to that foil on both sides. You see, I'm being very careful to not touch any solder onto the rod, and just kind of go quickly right here at a lower temperature. I had to resist the urge to try and make it perfect, because the more you work it, the hotter it gets and the more it wants to pull away. So just do it really quickly, and just paying extra attention that your rod is still able to swing. And then I'll flip it over on the other side and repeat. Now I'll put my lid back onto the base and push the rod down into seams B and C, add some flux, and then I'm going to tack them into place. So just be really careful right here to not put any solder on that elbow there and hinder your hinge in any way. We are almost there. Now I'm just going to cover up that seam with some solder. Alright, and here we go. She's all done. The hinge works perfectly. And the next step is just to add the jewelry chain to those hooks that we created. So I'm just going to take 2 jump rings, break them apart, put some chain on there, spin them back together. I'm going to measure it so that the box doesn't have any pull on it. I want to make sure that the chain is kind of keeping it down so it's not putting any extra pressure on that hinge. And then just attach it to the jump ring and put it into place. Lastly, I cleaned her all up with some quick clean and added some car wax for a nice shine. If you have any questions about this project, just leave me a comment below. Be sure to like and subscribe for more stained glass tutorials, and you can find us on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook at Blue Hill Glass Studio. We'd love to see your projects. Till next time, guys.